Hi, this is Bill Carmody with a review of the late Renaissance Polyphony. The Renaissance period was from about 1400 to 1600. The late Renaissance deals with just the last 50 years, 1550 to 1600. This is when the polyphonic style elements were most refined. To understand the techniques composers used during the Renaissance, you need to be familiar with these terms. In this podcast, be especially attentive to the unique terms of the period. Confirm the definitions of familiar terms and drill yourself to add the rest to your vocabulary. The most frequently used modes were Dorian and Mixolydian, but you should be familiar with all four of the church modes. The Aeolian, which is minor, and the Ionian, major modes, were less frequently used until the Baroque period. Key signatures were seldom used, but musica ficta, or false notes, were added, one, to avoid melodic tritone, and two, at cadences to create a leading tone. These accidentals were not written in the score, but were performed as was the custom. In modern editions, accidentals are usually written above the staff just as a reminder. Renaissance composers did not write with chords in mind. Instead, they focused on the intervals which were created by the separate voices above the bass note. Dissonances were only allowed in specific circumstances, which will be covered in this chapter. Learn these dissonant intervals. You will need to know them for your assignments. Cross-voicing was common, so the lowest sounding note was not always the lowest note in the score. See, for example, the first beat of the second measure in this example. Notice that the interval numbers are placed under the staff with the upper note. The number shows the interval above the lowest sounding note. You will be asked to do this in your assignment. Identify every interval. Circle any dissonant intervals and label them as shown here. Following is a list of dissonances allowed between any two voices. Unaccented refers to the weak beats, 2 and 4, or the second half of any beat, either ascending or descending. Accented passing tones are quarter notes on beats 2 or 4 and ascending only. Only lower neighboring tones were used and only as unstressed quarter notes. Although, quote, chord tones as such did not exist yet, dissonances were prepared or preceded by a consonance and followed or resolved by a consonance, as is later the case with most non-harmonic tones years later. The suspension was often, quote, decorated or embellished, either with a portamento figure or a pair of eighth notes. The portamento has usually 3 notes in that pattern: the preparation, the actual portamento, and the resolution. It's sort of like an anticipation. The nota cambiata was a popular melodic pattern which was similar to the later changing tone embellishment. This characteristic pattern is often found in Renaissance music, but rarely in later periods. In music for 3 or more voices, any dissonant interval may be treated as a suspension. A suspension has a long or tied consonant note, which becomes a dissonance and then is resolved down to a consonance. Their label usually includes the dissonance and consonant intervals, such as a 7-6, a 3-2, a 4-3, or a 2-1 suspension. The 6-5 figure is often missed in student analysis because we look at the intervals and don't see a number associated with a dissonance, a 2, 4, or 7. But the 6th in one voice and the 5th in another creates a second between the 6 and 5. Since intervals were only considered in relation to the lowest sounding note, Clashes between the upper notes were not of any special concern. Likewise, the consonant fourth is sometimes labeled as a dissonance, but this special case does not require resolution, although in this particular case, the fourth becomes a dissonance, a suspension, which does resolve. The consonant fourth always precedes an imminent cadence, like a cadential 6/4 chord. There are very few guidelines telling composers what they should do, but there are several rules, like commandments, telling what not to do. It is good to know these practices because they are still good advice for successful songs, even today. Although they didn't use sequences in the Renaissance, they did use imitation quite a bit. They liked it a lot. And the text settings, the text with one syllable per note. When there's more than one note for one syllable, that's called a melisma. And melismatic music, here's an example in measure 4, music that has one syllable but several notes. Also, by giving that one syllable longer duration, it's actually held out, that one syllable is held out for the whole measure. It's given an accent called an agogic accent. Agogic accent just means a rhythmic accent, a note that's longer than the surrounding notes. There are a bunch of other rhythm issues, so check it out on page 11 in your text. When you have tied notes, the longer note goes first, and they usually only use tied notes when it goes over a bar line. There are no quarter rests, kind of unusual. Start and end with a long note. Two separate voices never have the same rhythm at the same time. And a rhythm pattern is never repeated in the next measure. A single melody may be shared by two or more voices. The hocket happens when one voice rests while the other voice sings the next melodic note. So in this example, notice that voices 1 and 2, the top two voices, trade off a lot. And if you can imagine them in your head or play them at the piano, you'll see that it sounds like a single melody, even though the two voices are sharing that melody. Here's another example of a hocket. The melody is uninterrupted while one voice can take a breath. So that's when they used hockets. Clausula vera, cadences. They both approach the final, the last note, the tonic. The one voice goes up by half step and one voice goes down by whole step. And it's the antecedent of the later authentic cadence. That's where it came from. The plagal cadence is sort of reverse. It goes ascending fifths or a descending fourth. Up a fifth or down a fourth. Has to be at a cadence point at the end of the phrase. There's also a thing called a weak interior cadence. And this is just sort of a ghost cadence, a cadence that sounds like it should happen, but there's a rest in place of where the cadence should be. I'll play an example of this one, although it goes pretty fast. I'll play it a couple times. So that third measure, listen again. And last time. Okay, I hope you get the idea. Excerpts of this piece are used throughout this chapter as examples of Renaissance techniques. It is written for two voices, which makes it easy to see and hear how the parts interact. These original C-clef parts may be difficult for most to read, so the next slide has the same music in treble clefs only. Note the musica ficta, flat, above the top part in measure 5 and also on the fourth line. A clausula vera ends the piece, but there are other cadences along the way, and these cadences give the music a sense of form. Try to develop your ear to hear the imitations, cadences, and other Renaissance period techniques, some of which are highlighted here. For a more complete analysis, see your text, page 17, which shows the kind of analysis you are to do for your homework assignment 1.1. Here is a recording of this piece. Look in your text at assignment 1.2. We're going to do this in class, so you need to prepare it ahead of time. Use these rules, these numbered errors for each example. So which rule on this list is violated in example number 1 and 2, etc. Bring your answers to class. Do not do it in class. This is your assignment 1.1. There will either be an in-class handout or you can find it on page 23 in your text. First, find a measure where both parts have the same rhythm. There aren't any, except for measure 30, the last measure. Find 2 measures in a row in either part that have the same rhythm. There aren't any. Notice there is a preponderance of vertical consonances. Most of the notes are consonant. There are more passing tones than any other dissonances. Lots of imitation throughout. The 3 clausula vera give the piece form. And see if you can find the nota cambiatas, consonant or dissonant. Here's another copy of the terms for this chapter. Review any terms that you cannot define, explain, or discuss by memory. And that's what I'm going to ask you to do on the quiz. I'll give you, define these terms or compare them or talk about them in some way. And that's it. So good luck. See you later. Bye-bye.